So now we would like to take questions from the audience. We do have a hard time seeing people who are at the back, so if you want to ask questions, please do move closer. As with all the panels, we will be starting with questions from students, and we would like to keep discussion focused as much as possible on the relationship of the bank and the fund to these issues. So questions, please. Please.
My name is Sarah Boatme. I'm from CDE and I come from Lebanon. And I have a question related to we're all talking about how expensive it is, but how expensive it is to educate people more about the issue. I think the education is a very important element here in the formula. And second, we talked about insurance, for example, creating new laws for buildings. What about creating a certain obligation for all institutions in the society to conduct something that we technically call an EIA, environmental impact assessment, before creating any organization and knowing how much this organization will impact the environment? Thank you.
Who would like to take that?
Can I?
Sure, please.
Well, it actually is not that expensive to address the problem altogether. It just seems expensive. It's maybe 2% of our GDP to do something which actually would pay off very well. And the Stern report, which came out 5 years ago, was the first one that really sort of laid out at the global level that if you talk to Lord Stern today, he'll say, I would change those numbers a little bit. It's actually getting more expensive, but the gains are going to be even greater because the costs of climate change, are turning out to be coming quicker than we thought. On education, I mean, you're totally right. I mean, there are many, many examples in, for example, energy efficiency. Almost half of everything that needs to be done on mitigation to get to where we need to get to can be done at zero cost if you factor in the benefits you get in terms of saving money. And McKinsey did a report this last year that looked not only at climate change, it looked at all resources and did the same equivalent to the marginal abatement cost curves and showed broadly the same things. That's an issue of, why is it that people are not rational in whether it's changing light bulbs or putting in, building materials. And there are all kinds of principal agent issues that are well known, but education plays a very important role. Just one final point. I was in the Becker Valley about 6 months ago, meeting with a group of scientists and a group of farmers. And the Becker Valley is, well, the breadbasket of the Middle East, it used to be. Farmers there, now the scientists tell us that temperatures have risen by 1 degree centigrade. And the pests used to have 3 life cycles during the year and then die at winter. They now have 4 life cycles and don't die in the winter. You imagine how they're thinking about, and as Matt says, of course you have to adapt. These farmers are already starting to adapt. But they do need some help because the pace at which they're going to have to adapt is so rapid.
I could just add, is this on?
I think so.
One other point, and it's sort of interesting. So you started with the claim that it's expensive to do these things, and in many circumstances it is. But I think that the other idea is it's also, I'm an economist, for example. It's expensive not to do these things because there's this social cost that actually happens, and it depends on what your perspective is. So if you're an individual firm and you're making a profit-maximizing decision, yeah, these things are expensive. If you're the World Bank and you're the IMF, where your goal or your objective function should be more closely aligned with the complete social welfare, not just the financial aspects, then actually counting for these social costs, these externalities that were mentioned, should be actually part of the mission and should be entering explicitly in the calculation, which is actually sort of a call for more and more of non-market valuation to figure out what these costs actually are and how they factor into the decision-making about particular projects, which I think the last part of what you said is why aren't there actually rules or specific templates set up for how this decision-making should occur? And for that, I'll defer back to the panel about whether or not any of those are, I actually think it'd be interesting to know if any of those rules are actually applied internally to projects, and are they applied just analytically, or are they sort of enforced? Am I allowed to ask a question?
I think we can chat among ourselves later, so I think we should try to take more questions from the, I would like to get from, is there any other students that want to ask? Go ahead, Zoe.
So you mentioned, Mr. Steer, you mentioned that a lot of half of the investment in renewable energy was in the developing and emerging world themselves, and a lot of those initiatives are financed by those developing and emerging countries themselves. So what do you think that wealthy nations and institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF can learn from these developing and emerging nations themselves?
Well, a lot. I think it's that old-fashioned ideas are not always right. 40 developing countries now have feed-in tariffs. So when Philippines this year introduced a feed-in tariff, that means basically that the grid will purchase electricity at a higher price from renewable providers. Who pays that? It's the person who pays their electricity bill because the average price rises. That's happening around the world today, and there are about 20 countries at the moment that are looking at market-based instruments very seriously, whether cap and trade or carbon taxes. And back to the role of the World Bank, one of the interesting things that they are doing is they put together a fund of $100 million, provide technical assistance to these 20 countries. It's called the Partnership for Market Readiness, and the idea is that you take that willingness and that willingness to sort of actually go the extra mile and be part of a future that's different, and we don't know always why this happens. I mean, it's political leaders who see it's in their interest. It's a range of issues, range of reasons why people do it, why leaders in developing countries do it. But a useful role of the World Bank is to take that and make that the base upon which you then build later on. So yes, I think there's a lot that can be learned.
Wonderful. No, I'm going to look to see if there are any more students. Oh, right, wonderful. I see 2 students. So go ahead there.
Yeah, I'm doing a student in Sydney. And I have a question that given to the difficulties in convincing people in different countries, like government and taxpayer in different countries have more responsible for the problem in other countries, giving the fact that climate is a public good in the world. So should we invest more in training people adapt to the trend in climate? And instead of trying to waste time convincing different people in different countries about more, they should responsible more for climate change. Because in Vietnam, we talk more about training people how to adapt better to the climate change. Because we found out that it's very difficult to convincing other governments in the world have more responsibility for the climate change. So should World Bank more focus on that problem?
Wonderful.
I can take that. I was about a year ago in Vietnam, in the Mekong Delta, and the bank had a project to build sluice gates in the canals there to keep the salt water out so that farmers could grow rice. And what happened is that they were installing it and they reversed the sluice gates because they found that, in fact, they wanted the salty water because they could grow shrimp and it was more profitable. So that's a small scale example of the kind of adaptation that's happening all the time. And the adaptation is inevitable because it's happening. Like it or not, things are happening. But at the same time, there's a necessity for the global action. I was listening to some scientists just last week who are now very pessimistic. They think that there's a high likelihood that global temperatures will rise 4 degrees Celsius by 2100 and 8 degrees by 2300, which would mean just a totally different world. It's hard to imagine what kind of world that would be. And so to head off that kind of thing, collective action is needed now by everybody.
Go ahead there in the center back. Go ahead.
Okay. I think when we're talking about like environmental issues in developing countries, the question when we want to address maximization of welfare, I think the question is more tricky because even if we don't think about the maximization of profits for individual firms, because we can think it's like in Mozambique we try to introduce like green accounts, like or obliging like the firms to include the environmental issues in their costs. But if they would introduce it, I think many of the firms would be unsustainable in terms of return. And in many developing countries, like Mozambique, the small and medium firms employ many of the most share of the population. So if we want to address the problem we had when we tried to include like environmental issues in their maximizations or options of profits, it's like many firms would be unsustainable, and we would have loss in employment. So my question is, do we think for developing countries, do we think a lot about environmental issues? Because if you think about that, many firms maybe should not operate. But we have other contribution of those firms, although they pollute the environment, they contribute about the employment. I think my question is, what works more like for these countries?
Yes. And I should say we have 5 minutes left, so if you can answer this one, and then I'd like to take one more.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think what you're pointing to is that around the world there are great sort of experiments going on. Mozambique has one of the most innovative adaptation and resilience plans in Africa. What's the job of the World Bank? To help that, show that it works, demonstrate it up. Up the road in Kenya, they actually have done, they're a leader on small-scale renewable energy. They honestly believe, and they're right, that they can actually make money out of renewable energy. Wind, but especially solar, especially small-scale, portable lanterns and so on. Vietnam, I also lived there for 5 years, one of my favorite countries. You know, they have a green growth presidential commission. They have a climate change plan. They're trying to do interesting things on adaptation. The number of people that get killed in a typhoon today compared to when I lived there is only 1/10 of what it was, the same strength of typhoon. Why? Because they've got all kinds of preparedness and so on. What's the point? The point is not that anyone should be pushing Mozambique, you know, to spend more money on your energy because, you know, if it's not in your own interest. But given that there are all these incredible experiments out there, we should be highlighting them, demonstrating their work, scaling them up, financing them, and so on.
Just a related comment to that question in the previous one is I think sometimes when you think about developing versus developed countries and negotiations and about how to do things, how to change the energy mix and how to address the problem, I think that, you know, a decade ago, it was always about when climate change was this idea that the people in developed countries cared about. There was the developing countries had the argument, well, it's your responsibility. You created the problem. We're not going to participate and implement policies and try to help. that completely shifts and changes. This is another reason why this is the perfect problem when climate change actually starts to happen and we start feeling impacts. Because the truth is that much of the developing world is actually okay, both in terms of their geography, but also in terms of their income and their ability to adapt. And it's the developing countries that are actually vulnerable to the damages. So that's another argument for why there's an opportunity for leadership coming out of the developing countries to say, we're going to start taking action and pull in the developed countries to actually follow suit.
Great. We have 2 minutes left for a quick question. So go ahead, please.
Does the panel agree that for the sake of the survival of human civilization, the populations of the now rich countries must come to redefine a top goal of public policy away from the notion of continuous economic growth for the rich countries and achieve a notion of prosperity which is not linked to continuous economic growth? Is that a necessary condition for the survival of human civilization as we know it?
So a 1-minute answer from one of you gentlemen.
I would say yes, but it all depends upon the terminology. I think that there could be continued economic growth, but how we actually define economic progress, it applies all across the board. There's no limit to the economic prosperity that can happen, but what we include in our accounts and how we measure the cost is what has to change.
Can I answer?
Please.
No, growth can continue, but it will weigh less. More ballets and less coal-powered plants. What matters, since we're talking about climate change, is that each one in this room is emitting on average 18 tons per person per year. We're allowed 2 tons in 2050. China is now emitting 7 tons per person. It also, well, should it not only do but 2 tons but at some stage? India is just crossing the 2-ton level. Most of Africa is below 1 ton. So what we need to do is focus on the key indicators. And let me just say, I've not said a word about my new institution, the World Resources Institute. We're the leading institute in the world of measuring greenhouse gases and also measuring deforestation and measuring water scarcity and pollution. On greenhouse gases, 81% of the Fortune 500 companies today measure greenhouse gases using our technique. Interestingly, the World Bank can't. And the reason it can't, even though it does subscribe to something called the Carbon Disclosure Project, is because the board of the World Bank is not willing to allow the World Bank to measure its soup to nuts, what's called Scope 3 carbon investments. And this gets back to the governance issue and why last year, sorry to end on a controversial note, when the management of the World Bank proposed an end to coal lending, every single developing country chair said no. And every single rich country chair said, yes, let's end coal lending. So we need to get back to sort of the governance, which I think you were talking about last night, Robert.
Wonderful. Well, let's thank our panel, and we can wrap up and chat more later.